2. The traffic stop, where the nightmare begins. A flashlight beam seared through the darkness, slicing into Gabe Carter's eyes like a scalpel. He squinted against the glare, his pulse steady, but his mind already calculating. The desert air was thick, carrying the scent of asphalt and heat baked into the Texas highway. Deputy Sheriff Cole Grady stood outside his SUV, boots planted firmly, one hand resting on his service weapon. The silence stretched between them, tense and electric. This isn't routine. Gabe had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize a real traffic stop. This wasn't one. Step out of the vehicle. The order wasn't a request. It wasn't even the professional, detached tone of an officer enforcing the law. It was a command laced with malice, with a promise of something worse. Gabe inhaled slowly. His hands rested at 10 and 2 on the wheel, fingers steady despite the simmering dread coiling in his gut. "Officer, is there a reason I'm being stopped?" Grady's lips curled upward, his sunburned face splitting into a slow, knowing grin. He took a step closer, his shadow swallowing the window. "Boy, you heard me." And there it was, the first crack in the facade. Gabe had seen it before, too many times to count the sneer, the condescension, the way men like Grady didn't see him as a fellow officer or even as a man. Just a black guy on a dark highway, outnumbered, outgunned and alone. But they were wrong, because Gabriel Carter was never unarmed. He had his mind, his training. And one more thing, men like Grady always underestimated his patience. But patience had limits. Grady slammed his fist onto the SUV's hood, the impact loud in the quiet of the night. "Last chance, Carter. Get out of the damn car." A muscle in Gabe's jaw twitched. He flicked his gaze to the rear view. Another officer was stepping out of the patrol car. Younger, stockier, his buzz cut barely visible under the rim of his Stetson. Officer Travis Duke. 2 against 1, maybe more. The radio in Grady's car crackled softly, a murmur of static and dispatch codes. Who else was listening? Gabe knew the play. If he resisted even slightly, they'd claim he was a threat. If he moved too fast, they'd say he reached for a weapon. And if he hesitated, they'd make sure he regretted it. Stay calm. Stay alive. He exhaled slowly, unbuckling his seatbelt with deliberate precision, every motion calculated. Then carefully he reached for the door handle, stepping into the trap. The door creaked as Gabe stepped onto the roadside gravel, his 6'2" frame unfolding in the dim glow of the headlights. The desert wind stirred his navy tie, tugging at the neatly pressed fabric of his white dress shirt. Grady took a slow step forward, eyes glinting with something hungry. Power, control, the pleasure of forcing a man to kneel before him. "License and registration." Duke spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly neutral. Gabe nodded, moving smoothly. He didn't take his eyes off Grady, but he reached into his jacket pocket not too fast, not too slow, and retrieved his badge first. FBI. The 3 letters gleamed under the flashing red and blue lights as he flipped the wallet open. "I'm a federal agent. If you need identification, my badge is here." For a split second, the world paused. Duke's grip on his shotgun loosened ever so slightly. His eyes darted to Grady. But Grady, he didn't even look at the badge. He laughed. A slow, mocking chuckle as he leaned in, voice low enough that only Gabe could hear. "And I'm the goddamn governor. You think that badge means shit out here?" Then, before Gabe could react, Grady slapped the badge out of his hand. The leather wallet hit the dirt, skidding across the gravel. Gabe clenched his jaw. "Breathe. Don't react. Not yet." Grady watched him like a predator, waiting for the slightest twitch. Then, still smirking, he gestured toward the badge on the ground. "Go on. Pick it up." Gabe didn't move. He knew exactly what this was. A setup. If he bent down, he'd be vulnerable. If he refused, they'd escalate. It was a no-win situation. But Gabe wasn't about to play their game. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, squared his stance, and met Grady's gaze head-on. "I don't have to. You saw it. You know who I am." Grady's smirk faltered for half a second. Then, without warning, wham! Grady slammed his palm into Gabe's chest, shoving him backward. Gabe stumbled but caught himself, boots scraping against the dirt. Then came the baton. A blur of black steel as Grady swung hard, catching Gabe across the ribs. Pain exploded through his side, but he didn't go down. Grady grunted, like he was expecting something easier. And that pissed him off. He swung again. This time, Gabe twisted at the last second, the baton barely clipping his shoulder instead of cracking his ribs. A mistake. Because Grady wanted him to fight back. Wanted an excuse. Resisting? Grady snarled. Before Gabe could reply, Duke lunged forward from behind. Gabe barely had time to react before Duke's knee slammed into the back of his thigh, knocking his balance off. Grady grabbed his arm, twisting it back, and then cold steel snapped around his wrists. Handcuffs. Grady's breath was hot against his ear. Thought you were a big shot Fed, huh? Gabe exhaled through his nose, eyes burning as he stared at the ground. Blood dripped onto the dirt from a split on his lip where Grady had landed the butt of the baton against his face. His mind was racing. He knew how these things played out. No dash cam, no body cams. It would be their word against his. And men like Grady, they always controlled the narrative. The turning point. A second set of headlights appeared in the distance. Bright, fast-moving. A second patrol car. Reinforcements. Number. Gabe's stomach twisted. It wasn't backup. It was the cleanup crew. The ones who made sure men like him disappeared. Grady turned, lips curling in satisfaction. Perfect timing. The second patrol car screeched to a halt, kicking up dust. A third officer stepped out. Gabe recognized him immediately. Sergeant Ed Voss, a name whispered through every dirty case in Texas. The executioner. Voss strode forward, eyes scanning Gabe's bloodied face before smirking. Got ourselves a runner, huh? Yep, Grady said easily, adjusting his grip on Gabe's cuffs. Put up a fight, had to bring him in. Lies. So smooth, so effortless. Because in the end, it didn't matter what Gabe did. They'd already decided his fate. The only question now was whether he'd live long enough to change it. And just like that, Gabe was no longer an FBI agent, no longer a man with power, just another black guy in cuffs, at the mercy of a system built to bury him. What happens next? Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is only getting worse from here. A cold, metallic stench filled the air. Gabe Carter sat slumped in a steel chair, wrists raw and bleeding from the cuffs that had been yanked far too tight. His breath was slow, steady controlled. His head throbbed where Grady's baton had struck, a dull ache pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. Blood crusted on his lower lip, split from the impact of an officer's fist. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting eerie shadows on the peeling concrete walls. A single camera in the corner blinked red. He wasn't just being watched, he was being studied. This wasn't just a holding cell, it was a stage. Somewhere beyond these walls, a narrative was already being written about him. Inside the cage, the Raven Creek County Sheriff's Office wasn't a typical precinct, it was a fortress built on silence. The kind of place where people disappeared without leaving a trace. They hadn't taken him to a federal detention center, hadn't allowed him a phone call, hadn't even booked him into the system yet. They wanted him isolated, disoriented, vulnerable. The heavy steel door swung open with a groan. Sergeant Ed Voss entered first, his frame broad and imposing. His uniform, pressed and pristine, didn't match the ugliness behind his cold, calculating eyes. Behind him, Cole Grady followed, smirking. Look at you, hotshot. Not so big now, huh? Grady chuckled, circling Gabe like a wolf enjoying the scent of wounded prey. Gabe didn't flinch. Am I under arrest? His voice was hoarse but unwavering. Grady scoffed. Nah, Carter, you're just our guest. Voss set a black duffel bag down on the metal table between them, unzipped it. Gabe's gut clenched when he saw what was inside. His own FBI badge, his gun, and a stack of cocaine bricks. Planted evidence, the perfect weapon. Voss picked up one of the bricks, inspecting it casually. See, we got a little problem. He placed it back down. Some folks in high places don't like what you've been digging into. And you, well, you made yourself a loose end. Gabe kept his face neutral. He knew the game. They weren't trying to frame him. They were trying to break him. Grady leaned down, his breath stinking of tobacco. You're done, Carter. That badge? It's worthless now. The whole damn world thinks you're just another dirty Fed. Gabe frowned. What the hell was he talking about? Grady pulled a remote from his belt and pointed it toward a small television mounted in the corner of the room. With a click, the screen flickered to life, and Gabe felt his stomach drop. The media execution. The news broadcast was already in full swing. A local anchorone of the many puppets, Prescott-controlled, spoke in measured, serious tones. Breaking news out of Texas: Gabriel Carter, the FBI director of the Dallas field office, has been detained following a violent altercation with law enforcement. Sources say Carter resisted arrest and assaulted officers after a high-speed chase through Raven Creek. More disturbingly, investigators discovered significant quantities of narcotics in his possession, raising serious concerns about corruption within federal law enforcement. Gabe's fists clenched. It was a lie. All of it. Then, the screen cut to a grainy video. It showed Gabe stepping out of his SUV, but the footage had been doctored. It made it look like he lunged at Grady first, like he had reached for a weapon. Then came the worst part. Audio had been manipulated. A distorted voice edited in post-production played over the footage, his own words twisted beyond recognition. "I'll kill you, pig," Gabe inhaled sharply. He had never said those words. But now, millions of people thought he had. "Clever, huh?" Grady murmured, tilting his head towards the screen. "That little clip is already at 100,000 views. By morning, you'll be the most hated man in Texas." Gabe's mind raced. The video had been planted long before they even brought him in. They planned this. The anchors kept talking, feigning shock, pretending to ask the right questions. How deep does this corruption go? Was Carter working with cartels? What does the FBI have to say about this? Then came the real dagger to the chest. A live aerial shot of his home. Elena, his wife, standing on their front porch, surrounded by SWAT officers. Their 12-year-old son Jordan being led away in handcuffs. Gabe lunged forward, the chair scraping violently against the concrete. "You son of a bitch!" His voice was a roar, raw and unfiltered. Grady didn't even blink. "Told you, you're done." Voss sighed, shaking his head like he was watching a tragedy unfold. "The media is a funny thing, Carter. It doesn't matter what's real. It matters what people believe." Family under siege. 50 miles away in Houston, Elena Carter held her son's trembling hand as they stood in their own living room, now a crime scene. A burly officer tore through their couch cushions, tossing them onto the floor. Another officer ripped pictures from the wall, shaking them as if expecting drugs to fall out. Sergeant Ed Voss stood by the fireplace, watching it all unfold with amusement. Then he pulled a small plastic bag from his jacket. 1 pound of cocaine. He turned to Elena, holding it up. "Guess what we just found in your husband's office?" Elena's eyes burned with rage. "You planted that." Voss chuckled, tossing the bag onto the coffee table. "That's the thing about power, Mrs. Carter. It doesn't matter what's true. It only matters what we can prove." Jordan clutched his mother's arm, his breath shaky. "Mom, where's Dad?" Family under siege. 50 miles away in Houston, Elena Carter held her son's trembling hand as they stood in their own living room, now a crime scene. A burly officer tore through their couch cushions, tossing them onto the floor. Another officer ripped pictures from the wall, shaking them as if expecting drugs to fall out. Sergeant Ed Voss stood by the fireplace, watching it all unfold with amusement. Then he pulled a small plastic bag from his jacket. 1 pound of cocaine. He turned to Elena, holding it up. "Guess what we just found in your husband's office?" Elena's eyes burned with rage. "You planted that." Voss chuckled, tossing the bag onto the coffee table. "That's the thing about power, Mrs. Carter. It doesn't matter what's true. It only matters what we can prove." Jordan clutched his mother's arm, his breath shaky. "Mom, where's Dad?" The game has changed. The clock was ticking. His badge was worthless. His reputation was gone. His family was under attack. If Gabe didn't act soon, he wouldn't make it out alive. He needed a plan. He needed an ally. He needed to get the hell out of this cell before it became his grave. Because if Grady thought this was over, he was dead wrong. Gabe is running out of time, his name is ruined, his family is in danger, and the men behind this conspiracy want him buried. Can he turn the tables before it's too late? Hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next move is life or death.